I think we're missing. Oh, recording has started. We are waiting for Anita. I guess we can um,
She's
have
going to
her
be a minute.
join in a little bit, but let me go ahead and share my screen.
Josh, I heard that you were going to be at Summit, so I'm looking forward to seeing you there.
All right, here we go. Let me know when you see it. Oh, there it is. All right. So, hi, everyone. Welcome to the February 2025 edition of Champions Office Hours, Adobe Analytics Champions Office Hours. My name is Akia Walton. I am the Director of Analytics for Voice of America. I will give the rest of my fellow champions an opportunity to introduce themselves in a little bit. But just some logistics reminder, you will find a recording of these office hours hopefully after this, if not tomorrow, at the Adobe Analytics User Group YouTube channel. You can see the URL on the screen, but I will also drop it on the chat. But first, I will let my fellow champions introduce themselves. Christelle, you want to go first?
Sure. My name is Christelle Guyden. I work for a company called Gen Digital, which is an umbrella brand for cybersecurity brands. We have 7 of them: Norton, LifeLock, Avast, AVG, Avira, CCleaner, and Reputation Defender. Maybe you know one of those brands. And I've been doing Adobe Analytics for over 18 years. So I'm an SME for Adobe Analytics, and I'm very happy to help answer any questions you guys have. Jeff, you're up.
Had to get myself unmuted there. So yes, my name is Jeff Bloomer, and I have been the manager of digital analytics for Kroger Personal Finance for the past 6 years. And I've been with Kroger for, let's see, this would almost be 12 years. And I've been doing digital analytics for quite a while. I'll just leave it at that. Yes, and let's see. I am now a 4-time Adobe Analytics champion. I'm very active in the community advisors, and so that just kind of gives you an idea of the activity that I have. I'm involved quite a lot with all of this, so that's just a little bit of the different types of things that I do. So I do a lot on the Adobe Analytics side.
Awesome. I don't think I see any questions yet, but just a reminder for all attendees, if you have any questions related to Adobe Analytics, just drop them in the chat and we will bring it up to our champions. Anita just joined us. So Anita, did you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm sorry I'm late. I was stuck on a call. Like that never happens to anybody else. Yes, I'm Anita Mummert. I am a senior consultant with Blast X Consulting, and this is my second year as an Adobe champion. I think this is only like my second office hours that I've actually, helped out with. So I'm super excited. Y'all better have some good questions for us.
Awesome. I don't see any questions yet. So I'm actually going to. So one of the things that we keep seeing in Experience League are questions related to average time spent on average time on site, time spent per visit, basically time spent metrics in Adobe. And people get really, really confused in terms of the difference between both and how it affects different placement, especially if you drop them in freeform tables. So while we're waiting for questions, I'm actually going to jump in and take the time to kind of explain what are some of the different time spent metrics and the difference between those two particular metrics. So just so if you didn't know, average time spent on page is no longer available. Adobe recommends to use average time on site instead, and I will explain how you can use that later on. There's also a time spent per user, which is a lot similar to time spent per visitor, but that's mobile app specific, to measure time spent by device and users. But the three main things, especially related to websites, are average time on site. You can either get it in seconds or time format. And then time spent for visit, which is only available in seconds. You can actually, thanks to Jen Duncan, there's actually a hack where you can create a calculated metric to transform that into a time format. And then there's time spent per visitor. But it's these two, the first two in particular, that causes some confusion when people try to use them. So before I jump in particular on how you're applying this, I wanted to kind of go through how it's calculated. So this is one session with 5 hits. And these are, so the time per second is the duration, and then the time a second spent is for each particular hit. So somebody spent, landed on page A, spent 10 seconds there before doing something, whether it's a video play, but it's still, the dimension is still, EVAR1 is still page A. And then they go to page B and they come back to page A. And these are the different times associated with it. Also note that seconds spent on the last hit is 0 because it's not captured, because there's no ending timestamp unless you're tracking exit length events. That's the only time that it will actually capture the ending timestamp. But at default, there's none of that, and that's why you can't get time spent metrics for one-page visits or bounce visits. So how are the different time spent metrics calculated? So total seconds spent for page A is calculated based on which hits still is associated with page A. So you have 10, 20, and 15, so you get 45. And then time spent for a visit is divided by the number of visits. So this whole thing is 1. So the time spent for visit is 45 seconds. How average time on site is actually calculated is based on unbroken sequences. So there's 2 in this particular session because for the third hit, it's now associated with page B, and then you went back to page A. So it's still the same total seconds spent, but now you're dividing it by 2 because there's 2 unbroken sequences for page A in that one session. So how does this apply to everything else? So when you're breaking these 2 metrics by day, it's very similar because the number of visits will be as close to the number of unbroken sequences based on days. So there's very few visits that will go across different days, and that's the reasoning why this is so similar. But when you go through dimensions that you can have multiple sequences, the average time spent on site is actually lower than the time spent for visit, because time spent for visit is counting for the entire session, whereas average time spent on site is more focused on sequences. So if you break it down by page or any dimension, and you want to understand how much time is spent on that particular page during a visit, I always recommend using time spent per visit. But if you want to understand, for instance, how much time spent on a page per page view, average time on site is really helpful for that. For specific dimensions, you also could use average time spent on site, but you kind of have to think about if you're just targeting specific sequences for that dimension or the entire session in general. And then the other common questions that we get on Experience League regarding to this is when you use segments with these 2 metrics. So when you drop these segments as a row, average time on site will always be lower than time spent for a visit, because now average time spent on site is going to be a function of any dimension that is within that segment. So there's going to be a whole lot more unbroken sequences. That's why average time spent on site, when broken down by segments, is always going to be lower as opposed to time spent per visit. If you want to understand how much time is spent on a site during a visit for a particular segment, I always recommend time spent per visit. I'm trying to think of a situation where I would actually use average time spent on site with segments. But I think that that's more of a nuanced scenario. A lot of the common ones are going to be looking at the entire visits. For columns, you're going to see similarities, especially when you're breaking down by day, only because you're now calculating this based on a function by day. So visits and unbroken sequences will be similar. When you're adding segments, it narrows down the data just to that particular segment. So that's why you see average time spent on site for and time spent per visit is going to be a whole lot similar as if you were breaking down time spent per visit for segments by segment. So that covers time spent metrics. Let me see if we have any related questions.
Yeah, Holly Spellman just followed up with a question about time spent. So,
Okay.
can you see that, Kay, or do you want me to read it to you?
Yeah. We're having some trouble at my org figuring out which dimensions to use for time spent on site. We get different values for time spent metrics for the same pages, depending on whether we use our default page dimension, a page title evar, or page title prop. So it really depends on the user flow of that particular page. So for instance, a home page for time spent, time spent for visit is probably going to be higher because it's a common landing page, right? And so there are going to be many times where people will be able to see it, especially during a particular session. But whereas average time spent on site, it's going to be lower because you're looking at, well, I mean, for a homepage, usually you want them to go into content or to a different page. And so the average time spent specifically on that page per interaction or per unbroken sequence is going to be lower, especially for landing pages. So it's more of just thinking about what are you trying to get at and how your placement on free form tables and which time spent metrics. So you really kind of have to like think in terms of what you're trying to get at. What's your purpose of understanding time spent for that particular report, or what data you're trying to get at, and that's how you'll have to navigate in order to determine which one of these two particular metrics to use.
Kaya, can I make one comment about that?
Yeah.
She said when she was talking about the dimension, she was talking about page title evar versus page title prop. One thing to keep in mind is when you're using, because when you're talking about time spent on site, you need to be keeping in mind what you're trying to do. If you're on the site, you're thinking about visit level. So a prop, remember how a prop behaves. A prop is always at hit level. So a prop is you're immediately going to lose visibility of anything related to a prop as soon as the hit ends. Okay, so if you want to understand what's happening with a page, you want to use the evar. So a lot of times people like in the past, you would always execute both an evar and a prop of a page. So if you have both, you're going to want to look at the behavior that's going on with the evar version of that page. So anything that you're doing as it relates to that, you're going to be wanting to look at that information. You want to look at visit level. Remember, you're looking at that behavior. So site level, visit level. So yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Christelle.
Wouldn't expiration of the EVAR have a lot to do with this metric?
Yeah,
Like, can you guys comment on that?
Yeah, and thank you. Yes, also calling out the expiration of the EVAR can also have an effect on that. So all of those things, expiration of the EVAR, so all good things to keep in mind of how all that stuff works. Lots of things will fall into play there. But yeah, a prop. The first thing that you want to kind of not you don't want to pull a prop in there. You're going to be very disappointed if you're taking a look at prop level stuff when you're talking about time spent on site. Just want to make sure that I called that out. Super technicality seems like I'm splitting hairs, but we want to keep props out of time spent on site and things like that. So
yeah, and I think a lot of times people really want to use or should be using time spent per visit as opposed to average time spent on site. The only reason why average time spent on site is available is when you're trying to get a lot of these nuances of understanding time spent on a page per page view. Oh, it's clearly after 4 o'clock. And or being a little bit more nuanced and looking at it more granularly. But a lot of times people just want to understand. Anybody that landed on this page, I want to see how much they spent per visit overall. And that's why I always say use time spent per visit instead of average time spent on site.
Yeah, and the problem is you always have to think about it in seconds. So anytime you're doing your math, you have to take it into seconds if you want to know higher than that. That's the one thing that always kind of, it's like, oh, that's right. It's seconds. If I want to take it high, if I want to know how many minutes or all that stuff. So you have to take
That's why I always change the format. I just make a copy of it and change it. You can change it to a time format. And then you have your hours, HHMMSS, format. Because, I can't look at 3,000 seconds and tell you.
No, yeah, exactly. So always take
on that note, I'd love to see the hack from Jen. Can we cover that, Akaya, or not really?
Sure.
Surprising you with something there.
There you go.
I think it was already kind of created. Let me see.
I remember at one point we had something on our side of the business too for that. It's so much easier to look at than divided by, if it's like
you're just doing divided by 60 and that's it.
No,
time spent per visit.
It has to be more complicated than that.
No, right? I remember there was like a don't quote me on this. I remember there was like using 1,000 at some point, but I could be wrong on that. It's been a long time since I've dealt with this. So do not quote me on any of the math as it relates to this one.
So you just did like a copy of the time spent for a visit from Adobe, and then you just put the format to time. That's it?
Yep.
Oh, you just formatted.
Why didn't I think of that?
Easy. Hey.
Or you could just,
a Jen Dungan hack.
That's much better.
Yeah.
So shout out to Jen Dungan for that hack. I didn't learn that until a few months ago when she brought it up. Oh, and the other thing to note too, if you're dropping segments as rows for these two particular metrics, that this is going to be total, not average. So this was one of the recent questions on Experience League, where they were kind of confused because when you're looking at average for time spent, usually this particular column at the top of the table is the average, but they were seeing total. So if you're dropping segments here, it's going to give you a total.
And Akaya, actually, I'm learning here too. I tend to use, for example, if I'm looking at a page, which I tend to do more than looking at the whole visit, actually, I tend to use average time spent on site seconds. And not the visit one, the first one, right? I tend to use that and to use my page EVAR. Do you tend to do the opposite and use time spent per visit seconds instead?
Depends on what I'm trying to understand. So if I want to see for example, I want to see anybody that has touched this landing page. How long is that particular visit? Then I'll use time spent per visit, whether in seconds or time format. But if I just want to know, or in lieu of the average time spent on page, I would use average time spent on site. Now it has replaced that because now this gives me a breakdown of for every hit essentially or unbroken sequence, how much time have they spent on that particular page, as opposed to if they were landed on this page, went to another page, and came back. Um, Time spent per page will give you a cumulative time of those two different hits, but average time spent on page will give you an average of those two particular situation in that user flow.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right. Let's see. A break from time spent metrics. What do you think are the underrated features in Adobe CGA that you feel can be better utilized in organizations?
I had a couple, but I don't know who else here uses. I know you do, Jeff. Have used CJA. What do you know about CJA? I'm just wondering what you.
What do I know? Enough to make me dangerous.
Enough to be dangerous. Yeah. So, what do you think are like some of the most underutilized or underrated features of CJA that things that maybe people don't know so much about or don't use as much as they should? Or your favorite?
Derived fields.
Yeah. Yeah.
Derived fields for sure. Yeah. I mean, that's really what I'm just getting into right now. So I would say derived fields are probably what I think that's the thing. Although I will also have to say, like when you get into Adobe Analytics at first and you realize, oh, I only have so many EVARs and things like that. You get into CJA and go, oh, I only have that many derived fields. Okay, so it's the same thing. There are limits. There are always going to be limits in everything that you do. So you get into CJA, there are limits. So you get unlimited variables, and that's the thing. You get unlimited because you no longer have props and EVARs once you get into CJA. But be warned.
Yes.
Thou shalt be warned.
Yes. I mean, the thing that it does is it causes a nightmare for just governance, well, and it depends on.
It becomes a new. Exactly. You shall be organized before you just start throwing stuff because the whole rules about GIGO still apply. So I would say, in fact, if you're going to be doing CJA, you should be even more disciplined about your data before you go into CJA than you are about Adobe Analytics. Not that you shouldn't be disciplined about your data when you're in Adobe Analytics already. So if you're sitting there on the fence about CJA and you're like, oh, cool, this can clean up my stuff, you better get yourself organized before you decide to sit down and get into CJA, because as one of our other Adobe champions, Jake, says, it's all about your schema. Schema. Get that in line, and then you can start talking CJA.
So speaking of transition, is moving from Adobe Analytics to CGA really worth it if you're an Adobe Analytics power user, but only use the core analytics, not going to be pulling in outside data sources, etc.?
I think it is. If money is no object, I don't quite frankly know what the cost is because I haven't been involved at that level, but I do know that it's quite a bit more expensive, and that can be a bit of a showstopper. But there's just, and you say now that you're not joining any outside data, but I think you'll find reasons to start using those features because it's so easy to do. And
Yeah.
even if you're just talking about lookup data sets or things that you build yourself just so that you can, map data points, more easily, there's just a lot more that you can do to just really shape your data without having to. We had this conversation earlier in the chat. You're not depending on your developers to make sure it gets into a sprint or whatever. You're not depending on admins to make sure that things are set up this, properly. It's just that's another reason why you have to document it, is because it's so easy to do all this crazy stuff with it. But I don't know, I love it, so I would recommend it.
So I just wanted to touch on not going to be pulling in outside data sources. So that's really a myth for Adobe Analytics. That's not an ability. There is,
Right,
I'm
that's
going to
true.
try to find it and add it to the chat. Frederick Werner actually has a really great post, and we're doing testing for that right now of using Adobe Analytics as a data warehouse. It's free. And so
Data
being
sources,
able
right?
to pull like Google Search Console information. We're also trying to pull in podcast information and just being able to kind of see the lay of the land in one space, given how flexible workspace can be, is available in Adobe Analytics, not
Yeah.
just CGA. I think it's just a little bit easier in CGA, I think.
Yeah.
Yep.
Just,
Yeah, they call CJA cross channel for a reason. I mean, one of the very first benefits that Kroger realized by moving to CJA was, for the longest time, the biggest thing is, I mean, Kroger has a mobile app, and we have people that get on that also visit the Kroger site via web. And the thing is if you think about it, I can tell you right now, probably about 2/3 of our customers visit the website via a mobile device. So even though we have a mobile app, okay, our customers still visit the site on a mobile device. So the thing is being able to deduplicate a customer who's going to the mobile app, and then they're coming over, and then they're also using the web to place orders and things like that. Before, it would look like, if they're on a desktop or if they're doing other things, you could literally be seeing that same customer as anywhere of upwards of 3 to 4 people. Moving over to CJA, now you've got what if you've heard the term stitching. My favorite character is named Stitch, so I can very easily relate to that term. But stitching makes it a lot easier for you to deduplicate your customer, and now you are looking at, instead of 3 or 4, you're looking at one person in CJA. That's huge for your data, because you're deduplicating things and you're getting much cleaner data for your customer there. So that's one big selling point for CJA, and that's probably another one of the things that it's a big selling point for moving that direction. And then the other thing is also what I would call your offline data, being able to look at things like loyalty, in-store data, and stuff like that. Now, that's the other thing that you will end up paying for, because the more what I would call data views, data sources that you start connecting, that's where you also start racking up additional cost with CJA.
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
here's a question for the group. Do you think Adobe will force us into moving to CGA at some point?
Wait, this is an Adobe branded browser thing here. Or maybe we shouldn't say it for sure.
Wait.
They tell us no. They tell us, that is all I know, is that there is no plan currently to stop supporting Adobe Analytics.
No, there is not.
Soon. That doesn't mean they won't at some point, but we just don't know when that would be yet.
No, everything that we have been told is that Adobe Analytics will continue to be supported moving forward, that both CJA and Adobe Analytics will completely be run in parallel moving forward.
Yeah.
And from what I understand, there's a lot of customers, myself included, that are on Adobe Analytics and do not have CJA. So, if you don't have CJA, you're not alone.
Yeah.
I think it's like probably like half of us or something don't have CJA. So
Now,
yeah.
do we
And
get
they are
promo?
making
Yes, we
updates.
do.
Yeah, they are still making updates to Workspace. They've done some things that apply in both analytics and CJA. There are some things, obviously, they're putting a lot more focus on CJA. And so there are things that you'll get in CJA that you won't see in analytics, but that probably has
And
more to
vice
do with
versa.
the architecture. Yeah. So, if you want to future proof yourself, then absolutely. I mean, and I think CJA is a wonderful tool. So I recommend it if you can do it. And, if you can swallow the cost, absolutely, it's worth it. But if you just don't feel like you can at this time, I would not stress out about it.
Do
And I
not.
think you have time.
Yeah.
At the same time, if you have Adobe Analytics and you have no plans of moving to CJA, there is no shame in staying with Adobe Analytics either. So there's
Right.
Adobe Analytics is still a perfectly good product.
And Josh put in the chat retroactivity. So I think that's another
yeah.
big selling point of CJA is the back
Yeah.
visitor stitching that they can do.
Yeah.
Right? I'm pretty sure that's
Well,
what
it's not even that, but every change that you make, like if you decide you want to change your marketing channels around and you want to add things to different channels, and you hit the save button, and then everything in the history has changes to match those new rules. It's not, you don't have that cutoff point where you have to wait. Oh, there's going to be this period of time between here and here where you don't want to look at the data because it's going to be weird. It just
Anita, out
fixes
of
it.
curiosity, what's the processing power there? Does that take like 48 hours or
No,
is it
it's like
fast?
like minutes, like
Wow.
seconds. Honestly, yeah, it's you do it. You click the button, you go back, you refresh,
That's cool.
you're good. Yeah, it's crazy. It's
See,
crazy.
that's one of the things that I've always kind of got. That I was always frustrated with, like processing rules and stuff like that. It's like,
Yeah.
you got to wait 24, 48 hours for all that stuff to refresh. It's like,
Yes.
wait a week.
Or classifications are like that too.
Classification sets,
Yeah.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Nope, that doesn't apply in Adobe or CJA. That was a good one, Josh.
I don't think we have any questions. So if you have a question, just drop it into the chat. But as of right now, I don't see any.
If not, I'm going to pester you, Akaya.
Oh, yeah. Pester away.
I'm waiting to see if somebody put something in the chat. I feel like we really killed time spent, but I guess if nobody else has questions, but if you do, please do put it in the chat. Like we're here for you. Since there's, it seems like there's not really a way to track bounces, like time spent for bounces in Adobe Analytics. And if you have pages that are, more like I don't know. If you have pages that are more about like awareness, right? Then they have very high bounce rates. I guess I would look at like engagement metrics, like people taking actions on the page, but also like scroll rate. What do you guys do for scroll? Do you have like plugins that do 25%, 50%, 75%? Do you use other tools? What do you do to capture scroll rate? And I usually just tell people like I don't want to capture scroll rate because if I gave you that data, you would do nothing with it. Which is what I actually really think. I think that a lot of times when people want to look like too deep into things, they don't do much with the data. So first, I would ask like, hey, what are you going to do with this data if I implement it and give it to you? But I am curious to know, like, have you guys had that? Have you had that scenario, and how did you deal with it?
I would say actually, Christelle, we actually had scroll rate probably during the first year or two that I was at Kroger, where everybody's like, "Oh, how far are people scrolling?" And I was like, "Okay, well, that is an interesting metric," and I think it really had to do again with trying to understand this whole thing, and that was like trying to really because of how far were people going beyond the fold.
First fold, yeah.
Yeah, and then and that's kind of interesting to understand because of what was getting put there whether it was certain calls to action, and that's when they were first starting to implement our ecom stuff and things like that, because we were afraid that things were getting missed and so forth. So in those cases, that was good stuff to understand. But as it started getting further down the line, it just became kind of a useless metric, like you're talking about. And they eventually phased it out. But I would agree that it's like, what's the business question? I always like to have a business question behind versus, hey, can you tell me scroll rate? So I would say, as opposed to having the business prescribe to you a metric, I always like to go to them and say, what are the business questions you're trying to answer, which is a much better way to address most of the things that you're trying to understand. Measurement plan, business questions. Give me what your goals are as it relates to what you need to get handled versus I want to understand. Sorry, I shouldn't do it in that tone. That's disrespectful. But but I want to understand scroll rates. I want to understand. I mean, time spent on page is kind of one of those prescriptive things. More of those issues are the ways that we answer those problems, challenges, and whatnot. I would even say sometimes, like you're talking about with bounce rates, I think we've had that discussion in previous office hours where the difference between single page visits and stuff like that, where it gets a little bit deeper into even why people are bouncing, because I can say sometimes a bounce rate can be a good thing. A high turnaround bounce rate is actually a good
like
thing.
a support page or something like that, right?
Exactly. Or a situation where people are actually leaving to go to a partner site, and in that case, a bounce rate's good because we know that we're actually they're doing exactly what the page is meant for. So, yeah.
So for us, it's a constant problem, because we have two types of pages fundamentally. We have landing pages where obviously bounce visits is going to be a problem. And so we look at more at that. We don't really look at scroll rate, but look at the challenges that people have in terms of getting to that next stage, whether we didn't account for external links or they're just not finding what they're looking for. But our biggest challenge when it comes to being able to understand how much time people are spending on that particular page are our content pages, because we're in the news business. So when you land on an article, particularly, we don't really have this issue with video and audio because we have other measures like consumption rates for audio and video that we can measure time on that particular page. But for articles, especially, time spent on page is difficult because sometimes we'll have short articles or sometimes we'll have these long form content that requires a whole lot of time. So having sort of this one bucket for all is a challenge for us. So we try to use other page analytics tools to kind of understand scrolling and how people interact and what are some of the challenges that keep them from scrolling further. But pretty much it's an ongoing question that we have because
On
we
a
have
case
to
by case basis.
compare. Even if we're able to capture that time spent on that particular page, we now need to compare that to how long was this page.
Yeah, that matters. And the scroll tracking, just a thought that I had too, part of the reason that I don't typically recommend it, especially for analytics implementations, is that it costs. Every time you move, it throws another event, and that's another hit that's gonna, add to your volume. And if you've got that on all of your pages and you have a huge site, can you only imagine how big that becomes?
Definitely not doing that.
Yeah, it's like, unless you really need it for some reason. I mean, there are other tools that can measure that. Quantum Metrics really good at doing interaction, like scroll and heat map type tracking. So yeah.
Quantum Metrics is a great one. The issue I think there is that they sample data, right? And so
True. That's true.
That's an issue. This would
Mhm.
definitely be like Akaya is saying, it's a case by case basis. You can't just look at time spent, or like Jeff said, it depends on like what is that page supposed
Yeah.
to do, right? So I think this would be like on a case by case basis. I usually tend to shy away from all these things, like scroll rates or hover rates, even worse.
Uh,
Um, yeah. So I don't know if people hover on a button 10 seconds versus 20 seconds. What are you really doing with that information? I would really like to know before implementing it. But
um,
yeah, I was
Right.
curious to know if you guys do this on certain pages that are, that you're spending a lot of money on for awareness, for example. So,
Something I was going to ask also is, have any of you ever looked at like page influence or number of pages viewed per visit versus,
mm,
so
like page
like
depth.
yeah, like a page depth. Yeah. So if you're looking at a section, and I'm asking this kind of like out to the others on the call, where if you've got a section of pages, or if you have like a group of things that if you're looking for, like you're talking about engagement. So if you're looking at content engagement, so Kaya, with the new, so you got news stuff. So that you got like a group of pages that are at like around a particular section. I would wonder if you're looking at those kinds of things, with the number of articles, that a set of engagement. I would think that you're looking at kind of like a page depth. It's like they clicked on one thing and it's like, oh, that could lead to another. That drives interest in like another article or so. So I would think that might be driving into that page depth, or number of articles that as someone ends up diving into. So that kind of, I remember that we had a kind of analysis that we were looking at one point to understand different things that our customers might have been looking into, just kind of look at that influence as to what might be happening. So that's a different way to look at engagement in a particular section of your site. So that
Yeah.
would be a different way versus just that you've got that initial time spent and then that page depth and number of pages.
Yeah, there's a lot of factors that kind of feed into that. So, for if they land on articles, for example, and the point of for that particular newsroom just really wants their visitors to, it's all about site stickiness. And so they'll add these different widgets to encourage people to look at related sites. And so we'll look at page depth and also user flow to see where they're directing. Are they staying within the same section, or are they jumping off to a different topic?
Yep.
But we also look at publication dates. So if we're,
mhm,
for example, tracking a particular current event, and they landed on an older article just because it's something that search has indexed better than some of our newer content. Um, are they now then looking for newer content as they land on our site, or are they just happy with that particular article and then just jumping off, or they're just not interested based on what that article is pointing saying and then jumping off? And so there's a lot of different things to consider in lieu of time spent metrics. I mean, I will definitely tell you there is a benefit to using time spent metrics, but there are different situations where other measures might need to come to play.
Yep. Those navigation drivers and your search drivers. I can't tell you how much time I've spent sitting or being asked to I'm sorry, to evaluate. Oh, yeah, like you said, it's after 4. To evaluate search and things like that. And we've gone back. I have probably 3 or 4 different iterations of search reporting alone that we've gone back and back through and gone, oh, we can do it this way, we can do it this way. Just because of just because of the different types of analyses alone that you can do around search. It is and we always get a different idea each time. It's like, oh, we can probably do it from this different angle. I can't tell you the conversations we've had around that stuff alone. So, and everybody thinks they've got a new way to do search every single time. So,
I'm sure they do.
uh,
mhm.
Any other questions from?
Yeah, promise no more time spent.
Nah.
Questions. unless that's what people want. But
It's a common question. There's a lot of iteration of time spent questions on Experience League.
Yes,
And
we've done search with time spent. I promise you, we've done that.
Yep. We do ours. We do a lot of measuring, filtering, and sorting to understand if they're finding things. And then we are also big fans of search fail. That means when you use a query and it doesn't turn up anything, because those are keywords that your users are searching. And if you actually have content related to that keyword, you're not doing a good enough job in optimizing your metadata for that keyword. So it's usually the blind spot metrics are my favorite ones. You're muted, Jeff.
That's okay. I'm getting slap happy.
Oh.
All right. I don't think I see any other questions. If you're like me and you think about it later and you're like, I should have asked that. There is our EMEA, if you want to wake up early, our EMEA group is meeting towards the end of the month. I'll try to figure out when that is. And also, you could always ask it on Adobe Experience League, experienceleague.adobe.com. Most of us champions are like to hang out there and answer questions. So if you ask more time spent metrics questions, I'll probably answer them. So I don't see any other questions. So we're going to give you back 14 minutes of your time. Thank you again. And you'll, as I mentioned at the top of this session, we will be posting the recording of this office hours on the Adobe Analytics User Group YouTube channel. Thanks,
Thank you.
everybody.
Thank you all.
Thanks
This was
everybody
fun.
for coming.
Great. Thanks.